Welcome to the Disability and podcast, bringing together thoughtful discussion and debate. This month, Senior Editor of Disability Arts Online, Colin Hambrook, chats with writer and Chief Executive of CRIPtic Arts, Jamie Hale, about how CRIPtic Arts came into existence and Jamie's thoughts and approaches when working with disabled collaborators.
Welcome to the Disability and podcast. I'm absolutely delighted to have Jamie Hale, the Artistic Director of CRIPtic Arts, with us today. Hi Jamie, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm well, thank you. And you?
I'm really excited by all the things that I see that CRIPtic are up to. The organisation has gone on as such a trajectory, so kind of launching itself with the support of the Barbican, I guess that must have helped enormously. And I'd love to hear a bit more about how you conceived CRIPtic Arts and how you see it developing into the future, particularly in relationship to partnerships.
You're right when you say it's been quite a trajectory. It certainly isn't what I'd expected. I don't think I ever really saw myself running an organisation. It almost just happened. And I think for me it kind of came from the fact that I realised that if I wanted spaces I could perform in, the only way of finding those accessible spaces was to make them. And that grew into a realisation that I shouldn't just be doing that for myself, I should be doing that for other people as well. So after an initial one-off showcase at the Barbican, it just became increasingly obvious to me that there was an argument for starting an organisation to carry on that work, I guess. Yeah, we've been incredibly lucky in terms of the support we've had from the Arts Council, from the Barbican, from lots of other partners, from all sorts of programmes and work we've got going on. And I think it's sometimes difficult to keep track for me of exactly what our core is and was. But it feels like it's something about what happens for a disabled artist when you take away as many of the barriers as you possibly can and give them the space to create without those. What possibilities emerge, what art emerges, and what do the artists learn that they can take forward? And that's at the heart of what we try to do. And we're very much a kind of pan-impairment organisation. We are open to and work with all sorts of disabled people. But we're also quite aware that there are areas perhaps that we've got a specific expertise. And so there's always the interesting tension there of balancing where we focus our energy. For example, one of the things that I've always found difficult is how do you get booked for a performance when you don't know whether you'll be present, in hospital, alive, etc. That bookers can be quite nervous about that. And similarly, when you're saying, I don't just need wheelchair access, I need a changing places toilet, etc., then that starts to become a huge challenge for venues. So I think there's also a sense that the CRIPtic that I imagine is also an organisation that really looks for people whose needs aren't going to be met by other opportunities, where mainstream opportunities won't make anywhere near the accommodations they would need to be involved, and to really try and focus on and support those people without losing sight of being a wider organisation. And so I think that's how I want to see it develop, more and more opportunities for artists to grow, to share their work, more work changing the industry, and more work just creating a community of disabled artists, I think.
Working hybrid has been an important part of that, enabling access in a wider context, and it's great to see the kind of various programs CRIPtic are doing. Many of them are hybrid, performance and workshop wise. What are the challenges of working hybrid? It's the thinking that goes into creating high quality work has to be much more in depth.
It's something that we've been doing since the beginning in 2019, really. And, of course, that was before a lot of the recent artistic explosion in hybrid work and, honestly, the increase in quality of it. And originally it was very much there as an access provision for performers and to reassure venues that if the performer couldn't be there in person, that there would be something. The venue wouldn't suddenly be left with an empty theatre. They would perform hybrid, or there would be footage of their work, but there'd be something for the audience to see. And increasingly, I suppose we're exploring hybrid for its exciting creative possibilities beyond that. So while we would still aim that with all of our performance work, if somebody couldn't be there in person, we would find a way of making it work, because at the heart of what we do is finding a way of making it work for the people we're working with. I think we're also really excited about using hybrid work as a deliberate artistic choice. And I've seen some great work staged at our showcases previously that engaged with that. And I'm really excited to take my learning further in terms of developing that on my solo show, Quality of Life is Not a Measurable Outcome, and then also being able to take those learnings back to CRIPtic.
It's such a great title, that Quality of Life is Not a Measurable Outcome. It cuts to the heart of the ableism within the system. I know it's kind of developed out of the previous work, Not Dying. Where did the title Quality of Life is Not a Measurable Outcome come from? What's the story behind that?
It was something that was said in one of my many care assessment or care planning meetings as a sort of throwaway remark by somebody representing whichever service it was with. And it just stuck with me as a line. And I mean, the show has changed a lot. I remember your review of it because it was incredibly influential for me, because you focused praise on the comedy element of the work specifically, which was something that I was incredibly nervous about and which didn't come from my kind of established performance repertoire and was completely new. And so that really gave me the confidence to keep developing that element of the work at a time when I'd actually thought, do I want this in the show at all? So that was very helpful. So thank you for that. And I think it's also because the show has changed so much. When I first started writing it, it was at a point where my prognosis was incredibly bleak and we didn't really know what would happen, but it wasn't looking good. And it became a show about how do you come to terms with living when you might not have long. And then, for various reasons, I was started on an experimental treatment that completely changed my life. So it became a show about how do you come to terms with surviving when you didn't expect to, and what does it mean to live in the world as a disabled person. But by the time I had the show ready to perform, I think the day after the show at the Lyric, I was admitted to hospital and was in there for 6 months, very seriously ill. The survival chances were not good at various points, and I had either a 40 or a 60% chance of surviving the next 48 hours on the Sunday, when opening night for the show at the Barbican was the Friday. And I was told to give up on the show, and I refused to give up on the show. And by Thursday, I was in the theatre, still attached to all my IVs, medical team in the wings, and on Friday I was on stage performing a show about what it means to come to terms with the fact that you're not dying when things were, again, not looking good. And then again, a new treatment, a new care package, various changes, and things really opened up again. So it's been that kind of back and forth journey with the show. But I got a bit sick, honestly, of writing illness narratives. And I think that also came from reading an awful lot of applications for CRIPtic's programmes and seeing the same stories over and over again and feeling like I wanted to do something different. And I wanted to really contextualise the piece in terms of, for a non-disabled audience, really showing them that actually the thing that controls my life is the faceless panel that makes the decisions about my life. It's not my impairment. And so I rewrote the show, did a new R&D, and it became Quality of Life is Not a Measurable Outcome, in which it really, the second half is framed by constant jumps between me on stage and a Zoom care assessment panel discussing my case, in order to kind of frame the difference between the life that I'm having and the life that they are seeing and controlling.
I think that gives it a much stronger political intent, in that you're critiquing the system that underlines healthcare and those kind of hierarchical approaches that the medical sector is sort of set up to dish out, as it were. It sounds incredibly powerful to me, and I'm really excited by the project that we're working on together with telepresence with Paul Sermon at Brighton University, and I understand that you're kind of developing part of that show for the telepresence pilot, and it's a very telepresence is a digital platform that allows performers to perform together. It allows audiences actually into the digital space as well to engage. It's very complicated, but very, very exciting. And I'd love to hear a bit more about your thinking around what you're producing for that pilot.
I think I'm still trying to get my head around some of the technology and its possibilities and what that will mean. But from a kind of creative perspective, from my conversations with Paul, it feels like it would be fascinating to have lots of the performers, including myself, but also including the people playing the social care panel, all in the same Zoom room, so that the social care panel actors appear to be emerging from the Zoom, dragging the audience into a place of complicity, in which 1 minute the audience and the panel are all just heads on a screen, and the next minute the panel are the ones talking about me, and the audience are realising that they're just audience members talking. And that sense of how are we all complicit in the systems that society creates, even if we're not aware of how those systems operate.
Wow. And to do that using the arts to kind of give people that sense of their own power within any given situation, that seems like a really clever statement to make, and it could be a lot of fun as well.
I think it will be, and I've always been interested in playing with audience complicity with the piece. In one of the live versions, I encouraged the audience to do a show of hands to work out when they had last used something that wasn't wheelchair accessible, and to actually have to think, oh wow, that shop, that tube station, today or yesterday or the day before, that they were existing in a world that some people are completely blocked from. And again, I think it's about asking the audience to explore their own positionality.
I can see that as a very it kind of opens up something very new, I think, in terms of what the arts can do and how the arts can engage people. And I'm really excited seeing that develop. The telepresence stage, it offers an opportunity to change the disabled body visually, and you got quite excited by that idea and playing with that idea?
I did. I'm still grappling with it because I think there are so many moral and ethical complexities around this. I've got the question of, for example, do we edit out my headrest? Do we leave my headrest in? How does that change the shape of my head if you can see my head supports behind me? And does getting rid of them act to erase something of my being disabled? I think telepresence offers the bizarre opportunity for my character to get up and walk, but I'm really not interested in doing that. I think that's a cheap trick. But I am interested in, I guess, ways in which it perhaps allows us to see and explore the disabled body. I suppose depending on how much, for example, is graphically created and how much is created from the moving image. And I think I'm still really wrestling with whether I would want my body to do things due to telepresence that it wouldn't be able to do otherwise, and how to navigate that. Because I think otherwise we risk having this technology that could almost erase impairment for the purposes of the audience experience. And I don't want to do that, but I do want to explore whether there are ways that it can give them a more multi-dimensional understanding of it, and whether there are ways of distorting the image and the body and the shape that give something more of the interiority. I'm still working this out, as you can tell.
Yeah. There's something about challenging an audience's expectations that could open up possibilities for engagement in new ways, I guess, in bringing the audience actually into the conversation and allowing aspects of the audience to kind of, I guess, channel their responses. I mean, that's one of the exciting things that telepresence offers, isn't it? That it can break down that fourth wall in quite a new and innovatory way.
Yeah, I think I'm still very caught in how technically complex it is. I don't feel like I've really fully engaged with all of the possibilities.
It is a pilot. It is about experimentation, isn't it?
It is. It feels very big at the moment. I'm excited about it because one of the big barriers with the show is things like portability. And, for example, if I perform it with a performance interpreter, then it's reasonably portable for me to do it in London or for me to tour it, because I will always be able to find a performance BSL interpreter who will pick that up. But that if I want to perform it with my collaborator, DL Williams, then that's two people that you have to have in the same city at the same time, etc. And so I guess I'm interested there in whether there are ways that the telepresence element will in future make it possible for us to perform it separately, physically, while in the same space online, or even, for me to be on a stage in London and DL to be performing from home and to be digitally projected onto the stage, but such that you keep that sense of connection and interaction between us, and it doesn't just become watch a video of the BSL that is kind of timed to match with what the speaker is saying, but that keeps that sense of liveness, and that when you're working with disabled performers, travelling and touring to perform is a lot more challenging. I've got round-the-clock care, so it means bringing enough trained people to do as many shifts as I've got wherever I am, and the idea of having a show that I could, if my care fell apart, say, well, actually, I won't make it up to Northampton, but I'll be there on the screen instead. And that kind of sense of contingency and telepresence as performer access. So I think, yeah, I'm excited about it from that element. I'm excited about what it brings to the BSL and the possibilities of working more closely with DL, because in a cost-constrained environment, we wouldn't necessarily be looking at taking 2 people to the same city.
You've done some incredible experimentation with language with D.L. Williams, collaborating to turn aspects of the poetry within your performance into kind of synchronized languages. The intensity of that work was quite mind-boggling. When you were talking about, what was it, the amount of time that you took to get about 30-second kind of extract of poetry to synchronize the 2 languages precisely. Are you planning to take that further?
If I can secure the funding, yeah. It took us about 2.5 days to do 90 seconds, but I think now that we've established a process, it would be a lot faster. And I'd always intended the show to have a BSL element, but when I wrote it, I just assumed that I would use a performance interpreter initially. And I'm partially deaf, but I'm not a fluent signer. I prefer to go to productions with an interpreter. And I was just feeling that with an interpreter, deaf signers were getting a show that was a line or 2 behind, because they were constantly getting the interpretation of what I was saying. They weren't getting it in time with the action in the same way. And it felt like I was providing a substandard performance as a result, and I wasn't comfortable with that. So I commissioned DL to write a translation of the show, and that improved things. And at the R&D, we were then able to be a lot more kind of on roughly the same line at roughly the same time. But we still had the challenge of 2 very grammatically different languages, and I still came out of it feeling like the spoken English was privileged over the BSL, and that the BSL still came across as what it was, which was a translation of the piece that was designed to fit into my performance rather than a piece of its own. So what I wanted to do with DL basically was to rewrite from scratch, to take the spoken English right back to what do I mean, and the BSL back to what do I mean, and then to try and reconstruct something that worked equally well in both languages. And that also meant for me that I wanted, because a lot of the visual focus is often on me rather than on DL in the show, that I wanted deaf audiences to be getting the moment as my lighting changed or as the wings came out of the back of my chair. I wanted them to be getting the language that came with that. And similarly, I wanted hearing audiences who weren't signers to be able to watch DL and to recognise the iconic signs that look like what they mean, and for that to enhance what I was saying. So we kind of stripped it back to what are the key moments in this line where we have to have the language in sync, because we're giving away a key emotion, a key part of the narrative, something like that. And what are the key places where the sign that we would be using looks like it represents what the word says. And so we almost put pins in those and said, right, you know, the sign for lift or the sign for broken have to come when I say lift or broken, because they work, they match the wording perfectly. And then the idea that, you know, a key element will paint the ramps gold and silver. It wasn't that the colours had to be gold and silver in that moment in BSL. It's that you had to capture that ridiculous sparkliness. So we weren't necessarily looking for the same words, but to capture the same emotion at the same moment. So a listed building became a shit old building in BSL, because to convey the concept of a listed building just wasn't fluid. And what we wanted was to capture, you know, the frustration of a building that can't be changed. So we did a process where we were trying to rebuild something that worked grammatically well in both languages and linguistically well, and was emotive and beautiful and really gave them equal production value and equal performance value, rather than one language following the needs of the other. And that's what I want to develop further. And there are a lot of challenges also in terms of performing live simultaneously, because I had to know where DL was and DL had to know where I was in the line. And that was very challenging if DL couldn't hear me and if I couldn't see DL at that moment. So we're still wrestling with some of those elements. I think possibly someone sat in the front row with a little light may be the answer, just signalling to us both when to start to help us keep in time. But I also think this is something that we could bring into the telepresence element and have one of us in one place and the other in another, because at this point, if we can finish translating the whole script like that, the language will be so synchronised that that feeling of connection will be present regardless of whether we're in the same physical room.
That's very exciting, Jamie. The challenges of kind of exploring syntax in such a way, I can only just about grasp what that must mean. My kind of limited understanding of BSL. It seems that CRIPtic is a trailblazer in many ways in kind of exploring areas that where the arts haven't gone before. Is that fair to say? You've got kind of 4 programs on the go at the moment with Reach, Launchpad, Breakthrough, and Incubate. Do you want to say a bit about the kind of what's behind the thinking behind each of those areas of CRIPtic arts work?
Sure, I would like to think that we're trailblazing, but I kind of also recognise that the history of disability arts has been so forcibly fragmented that you end up repeating the work that a previous generation did because you don't have any access to that institutional knowledge. So I'm always cautious to think about whether what we're doing is actually trailblazing or whether we're doing work that's been done previously but maybe hasn't been given the prominence it should have been given and is now having a better chance at that prominence with society changing. A lot of CRIPtic honestly grew out of what I found the gaps were for me, and then how I could create something for others that responded to those gaps. So Launchpad was our initial programme, and that began as performing in our showcase and had a small development programme attached. And the idea was very much to support people to learn a bit about things like creative access, as well as putting their work on. But it was also about getting disabled people onto stages and giving them the kind of credit on their CV that would encourage other places to give them a second chance. Because I found that once I had the Barbican on mine, it made my life a lot easier because people treated that as a mark of quality. And so I wanted to find a way of giving that out to others. And Launchpad was very much create work, stage work, and then slowly became more about, develop your work and create your work and then staging it. But that, I guess, was our initial flagship. And I think Incubate was our second programme. And I always describe that as it's a programme in which you learn how not to make all of the mistakes I made when starting CRIPtic, so that at least you'll make different mistakes. And it was about creating a space and bringing 4 people who are building arts organisations together to learn partly about all of the legal stuff, finance, why you have to do accounting, what tools are out there, what types of company registration and what the obligations are, but also things like leadership, project management, team management, skills like that, as well as knowledge, and really trying to build people into being the leaders that their organisations would need. And in some ways that's my favourite programme, because it's just once a month, me with 4 other people, and it's really exciting, and I learn so much from the other people and organisations, and that's very core to it. And it's also about, I think, we are all forced to compete for limited funding pots, but do we really want to always be competing? And it's about how can we set up networks that are about sharing and supporting and encouraging and boosting, rather than having to see other people as our constant competition. Then Reach is a kind of writer development program for people writing their first full-length play, and that, in its first year, was almost the predecessor for Launchpad, for people who had a good idea, but I didn't think were quite ready to do Launchpad at that point, but who I wanted to support. But this year I'm very much seeing it a lot more about it in its own value of supporting people to create work together, and that's led by the incredible Nikki Miles Walden. So I'm actually quite hands-off on that one because Nikki is so great. But this year that's been a lot more about seeing it as a program with its own value, and not just about being a starting point for people, but being about a focused development for people who are really committed to the idea of writing this play. With all three of those programs, one of the things that's really vital is that everyone on them is paid, not just to perform, obviously, but also if there's a mandatory session on creative captioning or marketing your work, or to attend each of the incubate sessions, people are paid to come, to be there, to learn. And it's not a large amount of money, but it's about recognising that if you're sat in one of our sessions, you're not at work being paid, and that we didn't want people to be unable to apply for our programmes because they couldn't afford to not work in the evenings. So it became very much about paying people as a way of removing that barrier as well. Yeah, that's something that's really important to me. And then Breakthrough, I've seen more and more opportunities for emerging disabled people in the arts. But what happens when you've emerged? What happens when you've done loads of opportunities in disability arts, and maybe you've had a few opportunities outside it, but you're working at an incredibly high level and not being given a chance by the mainstream arts world? And I think one of the reasons that happens is because we're also used to being forced to do things on a shoestring. So our budgets are tiny, and then that can be reflected in the samples of work we have, in the show reels we have, in the things we have to show industry what we're working on. So Breakthrough became about have $6,000 to make something tiny. Like, we want a single song, or we want footage of 5 minutes of your play, and we want you to commission really good people to work with you on it, to get it professionally edited, to get it all done to such a high production quality that you're no longer being held back and people aren't looking at the production quality and assessing your talent through it, and instead you're showing, this is what I could do if I was given access to the kinds of resources I need to do it. And specifically for people who can see what the disabling barrier they're facing is, and how doing this would challenge that specific barrier. So it's that kind of a concept, I guess, and really trying to recognise that also disabled people often age out of young people's opportunities before we've really had a chance to get started, because we're facing so many other barriers, and that's going to be a lot more challenging for disabled people from the global majority, for disabled women, for working class disabled people, for disabled people with parenting and caring responsibilities, where you don't necessarily have that free period in your early 20s to go and make art and do all of the programmes. So that's also what Breakthrough is about. It's about giving people something to help them get to that next level. And I guess that's what we always want to do, is find people where our programmes we think will provoke a change in their practice, a growth in their practice, a change in the opportunities they have, something that will be a long-term impact, not just a single performance commission.
That's so important. I've worked in disability arts for a very long time now, since the mid 1990s, and again and again the key barrier, that sort of lack of investment in productions, in individuals developing their talents, I think the key thing that's led to that sort of fragmentary nature of disability arts. As you say, the new generations coming through are constantly relearning, because the work made by older generations hasn't hit those high notes, not because of the lack of quality of the work being made, but the lack of investment has meant that it's not been documented, or it's never got past the gatekeepers to the larger institutions. The nuance of thought behind that programme, it feels very well thought through and really important if disability arts is ever going to evolve to the next stage of it being understood and considered as an art form that talks about what it is to be a human being.
And that's one of the things I found really both challenging and interesting, that obviously I read a lot of applications for our projects. I think across those 4 we had almost 200 in this round for I think about 15 places. And over and over again I was reading, and these were often really incredible pitches, but my diagnosis story, or my experiences of the medical system, or this is what it's like to live with this condition. And I just keep thinking, are we not allowed to go beyond that? Being disabled touches on something profoundly human, and it touches on something profoundly terrifying, because realistically, many people are going to become disabled in their lifetimes unless they die before they get a chance. So I think there's this fear of work about disability from non-disabled people, because it touches on that point of them that is so afraid of what it might mean for this to happen to them. But there's also this way in which we're very much limited and expected to tell those stories rather than having other stories, rather than talking about something completely separate, work that issues from one's own experience of being disabled because one is disabled, but that doesn't have to be explicitly about disability. Or maybe it is, but it's a completely different or completely new take on it. And I feel like I'm desperate to encourage disabled people to be like, you have value as a whole person and as an artist to speak to the universal. Your work matters about your humanity, about what you're interested in, about what you want to make work about. If you keep doing my disability story, you're selling yourself short because you've got so much else that you could be doing. And I think for me, that's why quality of life is not a measurable outcome had to take such a political turn, because I had to do something that wasn't just listen to me talk about being disabled, in the same way that I'm now really keen to support other people to do that. And that's not because I don't want there to be more work about what it is to be disabled, but it's because if I get 30 or 40 almost identical pitches about a certain theme, a certain performance style, etc., then that work is already being made. If that many people are pitching it, people will be developing it. So how can I be encouraging people to develop stuff beyond this?
And there's an intersectional element to the work that CRIPtic does that underpins that that drive to search for different stories, for the narrative around disability to be nuanced with other aspects of lived experience. Perhaps we can move on to the crypt monologues, because I know that's something that's coming up, and I think the crypt monologues kind of demonstrates that very well. It's a show that you've curated with a number of other disabled performers. Do you want to tell us a bit about the crypt monologues and how you devised it, how you brought in all those different voices, and the thinking behind the curation of it?
It was one of those projects that seemed like a good idea at the time. It came from this sense that, as somebody who is very visibly disabled, who is a permanent electric wheelchair user, that I am constantly having my body scrutinised and questioned and examined when I move through society, and yet people are ashamed to be caught staring and cannot stop themselves staring. And I started to think, well, what if I gave them everything they're staring at, but they couldn't escape the fact that I was staring back at them? So it became 2 short monologues, and I pitched this to and then developed it at Camden People's Theatre, both of which were performed by me stark naked. This is not my natural state of being. I am not somebody who is comfortable like that. This is why I say it seemed like a good idea at the time. But it was kind of about, like, let them stare at all of the holes in my body. Like, but how uncomfortable are they when I'm staring at them and when they've got nowhere else to look? It felt really empowering, because for once I was being stared at entirely on my own terms, and that was great to have that sense. And so we commissioned, I think in the end, about 14 monologues, and our long-term plan is to try and take them all through development and to get them all ready for performance. But we've had to focus on a few at a time at the moment, just because we couldn't develop all of them financially or practically when they're all about 15 minutes long. And we wanted pieces that kind of spoke to what it means to be a disabled person, that kind of explored that sense of scrutiny, but in interesting ways, and that really brought in a variety of disabled experiences, but that were centred around the experience of being what I described as the kind of disabled person who can't enter a room without being stared at. And that felt like quite a politically and socially complicated thing to do, because I didn't want it to seem like I was privileging or prioritising one type of impairment. I know that there's a lot of very difficult discourse around what is often framed as visible and invisible, though I have problems with some of that language. And it's something that I very much struggle with as somebody who is both immediately perceived as disabled, but who has a lot of impairments that are not immediately noticed, and who kind of exists within both spectrums of that. But I wanted this project to be about the scrutiny you face when you cannot escape being stared at all because you look different. And so then essentially it was reading the pitches, commissioning the monologues, and then working out which set of monologues worked together really well. And I wanted to capture lots of different experiences. So one that kind of explores, I guess, bodily autonomy and violence, and what it means not just to be disabled, but also to be a trans person, and also to be a person from the global majority, and how that affects how systems engage with and treat and medicalise you. One that was very much about sex and personal care, because actually when you're dependent on other people for a huge amount of your physical daily living activities, that becomes a very relevant question, and one that's rarely addressed. One about kind of medical discrimination and motherhood, and I think we often don't get to explore disabled people as parents, so that felt really valuable. And then the final one, which is very different, is just a meditation on what it means to have an impairment and then to move from that to being part of a disabled community, and those connections and the beauty and the reaching and the learning that comes out of that. And for me, that piece just brings them all together because it becomes this celebration of communality. But what I've always wanted from the Crip monologues is for the pieces to be able to disagree, to be presenting lots of different stories and narratives, lots of different ways of feeling about being disabled and about the medical system and about bodies and about scrutiny, rather than saying this is the disabled experience. So I would love to go on to other commissioning rounds and focus on very specific themes. So in the same way that was people who can't enter a room without being stared at, I would love to do one on people who do not communicate using physical speech in spoken English, and exploring commissioning work by people who use AAC devices, by deaf signers, by people who communicate in other ways, and just commissioning little groups of monologues on as many themes as possible that could eventually come together into a book of wildly different monologues that any group of disabled people could put on a show from by reading through and finding the monologues that spoke to them.
That's really exciting, and I dare I say it's taking disability arts in a very new direction. I think one of the things that's held the disability arts movement back has been that sort of agitprop. You have to think this way, limiting the kind of expression into important political statements nonetheless, but a kind of modus that can be very constricting.
And I think also sometimes there's such a focus on we are all part of the disabled community that there isn't much room for exploring the differences within that. And I think we're getting better at being able to, for example, hold space for, and I say this as a trans person, disabled trans people or disabled queer people, and to hold a space for that and to recognise that that has its own specific experience. And yet we still struggle to talk about the very different experiences that people have, partly due to impairment, partly due to other factors, but that we struggle to create space for people who have a shared experience without it feeling like we're excluding another set of people deliberately. And I suppose in some ways, we are excluding that other set of people because we're saying this space is for people who have this experience. And I think there's so little money and there's so few spaces that the minute you create that, there is this terror that what if that's the only space that's going to exist and there's no room for me anymore because I don't fit into that space. But I do think it's really important, and particularly because a lot of our work is about, I guess, also training disabled people to work in a sector and to understand what their access requirements are and how to advocate for those, that there is a call sometimes for creating a space and an opportunity that relates to something like the experience of being unable to enter a room without being stared at, and trying to do that in a way that, it's something I'm really excited about doing but nervous about doing wrong.
I think the arts, more so now than ever, have that sort of competitive and corporate kind of aspect to them. I think we can, by working together, by working in a way, organisations supporting each other rather than working competitively against each other. There is something precious, I think, in creating those spaces where failure and the lessons learned from that an important, understood as an important part of moving forward.
And it's something that we're trying to do quite publicly at CRIPtic as well, that we do that when we reflect on a programme and we work on our lessons learned, we try and publish it on the website as well. Because I think people, again, how are you going to learn to not make the same mistakes if no one will say what the mistakes are? And so at the moment, one of the things I've been working on has been our post-application and kind of post-programme setup to think about why applications weren't selected, but also what we've learned about how we have to change our processes as a result. And I think it's really about organisations feeling secure to be transparent about the things that haven't worked and the things that they've struggled with, so that other organisations can learn from them. And I've been incredibly lucky to have a lot of support, and a lot of that has come from two particular organisations: Tourette's Hero, another disability arts company led by Jess Tom, and Spread the Word, which is London's writer development organisation, and is led by Ruth Harrison. And both Jess and Ruth have been incredibly generous with me in terms of sharing learning and mentoring and advice, which has helped me avoid making some really big errors of judgment. I'm really keen to think about how I can keep sharing our learning, because I think the only way that you can create a sector that has the courage to do that is by doing that yourself.
Absolutely. It's something that we at Disability Arts Online kind of think about a lot, and talk about, and finding ways of looking after each other has been an important part, actually, of the development of the organisation in the last few years, in particular since the pandemic, but wanting also to extend that sense of politics of care out to the artists that we work with and the other organisations that we work with. That learning is a big thing. It's something that is sort of going on in the background, those conversations.
And also, I was fascinated by what you said briefly about the ethics of care, because it's something we've struggled with hugely, in that we really work to extend that ethics of care to our artists. But what does that do to our team? And where do we have to set a balance? If I need to get final scripts to the BSL translator by a certain date, and before that I need to do a final round of edits, and someone is struggling and needs the deadline extended and extended and extended, and yet I cannot push the BSL deadline because that risks compromising the quality of the signed work. So the bit in the middle that gets squashed is my time, and how do you balance your own access needs, and how do you create ways of supporting people, particularly in an industry like theatre where the curtain goes up when the curtain goes up. In some ways, it's the challenge of access riders, right? That I can present my access rider to an organisation, and if they're not disabled, then that's, they get that. They have the responsibility. There are certain things I need in communications, etc. But what about if they're also disabled and they have needs in how they communicate with me? And what if our needs don't match? And the idea that an access rider is almost, well, it's a rider, it's a set of needs that you're presenting. But how do you balance that when you're both disabled and you've both got needs and you're trying to create ways of working that function for you both? And I think that's a challenge often for disabled-led organisations working with disabled people, of balancing your internal team and the external people you're working with, and not compromising one set of people's access needs for the other, and also seeing access and care as a conversation and as something you build together and as something that you have to find creative ways around navigating. Because if you've got people whose needs don't fit together easily, you're going to have to find a way of dealing with it that you wouldn't if you were working with a non-disabled led organisation, where it would just be a case of, here are my needs. And I'm interested, I guess, in how that can be a creative force for building cultures of care and understanding and access, and how we can learn to have those conversations and communications. And I think it is such a difficult and exciting challenge to be faced with.
And I think potentially quite revolutionary in breaking down those hierarchies, which are kind of those structures are kind of there to give a framework, but they limit and they constrict so much.
And also, what about if we think about it as, how can we remove the barriers that make it hard for you to succeed in the ways you want to succeed? How could we, because then it becomes about a communal conversation, because for the performer to succeed, they need me to be working effectively as a director. For my directing to succeed, I need the performer to be working effectively as a performer. So it becomes about, what do we both need as disabled people to create a successful joint shared piece of work? And I think that there's a huge amount that society can learn about this as well, and about it not just being a tick box exercise of you need A, B, C, but instead about it being, these are the barriers that are making it hard for people to succeed. What can we do about them so that we all feel able to put our whole selves into the creative work, because our needs are being held more broadly?
Yeah.
That's leaving you with a challenge and a provocation for the industry, isn't it?
It absolutely, and a terrific opportunity as well, I think, in thinking about those things and carrying them forward. Sadly, we're going to have to bring our conversation to an end. I'd love to hear a bit from you about what CRIPtic have got lined up. Perhaps you'd say a bit about what's on the horizon in the next few months.
So yeah, we've got the Crip monologues at Camden People's Theatre. And then after that, the next thing coming up is Quality of Life is Not a Measurable Outcome, which will be on at the Roundhouse. Following that, our big show this autumn will be back at the Barbican with 5 performances. And I think those are our 3 remaining big projects for the year, because we will have wrapped up both Self and Other at Home Manchester, and earlier this year we did 2 Crip, 2 Queer at the Bloomsbury Theatre. So 1 year, 5 shows, lots of work, no full-time employees.
That's staggering. What can I say? Watching CRIPtic rise and the output kind of developing, it's been a huge pleasure to see that happening. We've had some great conversations before, Jamie, and I hope we can continue to develop ways of working together.
I would really love that. And just before we wrap up, I just want to make sure that I share the credit for CRIPtic's growth with our lead producer, Caitlin Richards, who is not the one whose face everyone sees all the time, but who is very much the powerhouse that means that all of my wild new ideas can actually take shape and happen. And I think I never want CRIPtic to be the Jamie Hale show. One day I dream of being able to move on into another role and see someone else take CRIPtic and grow it further and bigger and in new directions. But the CRIPtic that we have has been built by a lot of people, and a lot of people have been a part of it. But Caitlin's been around since almost the beginning, and it's been our partnership really that's built it. So I wanted to make sure that credit got shared where it was due.
Big shout out to Caitlin.
Thank you so much for such a lovely conversation, Colin.
Thank you, Janie. It's always a delight, and thank you to our audience as well for listening in. And on that note, we'll say goodbye, and I look forward to getting to the Camden People's Theatre. And I think on that note, it's a wrap, as they say.
Indeed. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. We do hope you've enjoyed this episode of Disability And. For previous episodes of Disability And, please go to www.disabilityarts.online/projects, where you'll find a link to the Disability And homepage. Next month, Paul Wilshaw chats with Suzanne Loftus and Abigail Bryden of Cutting Edge Theatre Company about the art scene in Scotland and Cutting Edge's production Downs with Love.